Working. I don't know why.
Okay.
No list, but I'll read.
So we're working our way now through the third book of the Torah, the book of Vayikra. I think it bears mentioning that today is a special day in the Jewish calendar because we are in the month of Adar. Adar is the month before Pesach. Pesach is the month of Nisan. So if we start look at our calendar as beginning from the month of Nisan, that's and the Torah calls that the first of the months. So then the 12th month, the final month, is the month of Adar. And Adar is a month which we celebrate Purim. On the 14th day of Adar is every year is Purim, and 1 month later, the 14th day of Nisan is when the Passover offering is brought, and at night is the 15th. That's when we celebrate Pesach. So that's every year. In our calendar, in the Jewish calendar, which is a 19-year cycle, it's set up so that the Pesach is always in the spring, because the Torah, even we have a lunar calendar, which if it's lunar, that means it really is totally unplugged from the seasons, which are solar based, and that's why a purely lunar calendar will float through all the seasons, because a 12 months, roughly speaking, of 29 or 30 days is going to be less than 365-day revolution of the sun, of the seasons. So it's always going to be roughly 11 days shorter. A lunar year is always going to be roughly 11 days shorter, and therefore it'll always go back and back and back, and it'll go through all the seasons. Since Pesach has to be the Torah calls it a spring holiday, therefore there is a mechanism, which we call a Jewish leap year, which happens 7 times over the 19-year cycle, to push, it's every 2-3 years, to push things forward an entire month. And that is the way that's done, is the month, as in the days of old, when it was done by a court, as they approached, they came to now to look at the month of Adar, and we see where Adar is, and now they start measuring up. They see how Pesach is going to be. So then we see whether or not Pesach is, you're within striking distance of Pesach, and it would come close to being winter. In other words, because it's always 11 days earlier, so it will be bumped or jump out of spring back into winter. They would insert a second Adar, another Adar, second Adar, another Adar, so there will be 2 Adars, and that way the whole system was pushed forward by a month. Pesach would be back in the spring for another couple of years until we have to catch up again, and then there would be and everything else moves forward. That's why the Jewish calendar is, as they say, the holidays are never on time. They're early, they're late. But it's because we're always adjusting. It's 11 days earlier in the solar year, then maybe push it up another 30 days. So this is this year we're in is a Jewish leap year, which means that there are 2 Adars. We are now presently in Adar 1, and then we'll be going into Adar 2, and there's a debate halachically, and for some of us, and I get questions of this every year about what does one do with a yard site that's in Adar. My father has yard site in Adar for his father. It's it happens. So how do we deal with it? Which is with the real Adar? Please stand up. So there is no such thing as a real Adar, and there's enough debate and perspective for both sides of the coin of this. But accepted Jewish practice is that for the mitzvahs, the things that we really can't have it done, both Adars. We're making blessings. We have to choose one or the other. We choose the one that is closest to Pesach, which is the second Adar. So Purim which is always on the 14th of Adar, when it's in a when it's Jewish leap year, it's the 14th of Adar too, Adar B, Adar Bet, which is next Adar. At the same time, we're still in Adar, and therefore we give respect to the idea that their Adar, even Adar 1, has a very special Adar energy, and even the 14th of Adar, which today is the 14th of Adar 1, which means today is Purim of Adar 1, and it's known in Halacha as Purim Katan, the smaller Purim. So it's a day when we remember it. There's actually some modifications to our services. There's no penitential prayers. It is a day which we recognize, and we want to plug into the Purim theme. It's not Purim yet. Purim isn't exactly a month, but today is Purim Katan, and it's a special day. So I think we gotta. We have to mention that in the beginning before we get into our specific text. So now, with regard to what we're studying, again, we're going through the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, and I guess I keep repeating this every time we start, but I feel the need, at least at this point, that we're studying about offerings that were brought in the temple. These were deeply spiritual and meaningful exercises. They did take, in many of the cases, they took the offering of an animal, which means that the animal lost its life, either to be eaten or to be offered on an altar. It's not in our, for those who are vegetarian, they may not even be able to feel good about taking an animal's life for food. For those of us who are not, and I'm not vegetarian, and there's certainly within Jewish practice, there are times when the advice is to specifically have meat or something that the body can enjoy like that. But at the end of the day, you're taking a life, so you're taking a life to be able to, for the sake of human need. And the idea is that when we use the nutrients of the animal that we've ingested, that we've digested, and use it properly, we're also elevating the animal's life. But here, for the offering, it's I think in our psyche, it's going to be a little bit off here. We're talking to God. God, what does God need us to take the poor animal's life for? It's just, this is something we can struggle with every week, if you like, but this is certainly there within the Torah system as it was practiced, and what we want to be able to focus on, relevant to our lives, is what was meant to be really the soul of this exercise. Because whatever was being done was a very important functional matter, but there's a lesson for us until today in all of these things of what we can do, what we can, and how we can bring our own offering without the animal, so to speak. So what I sent out, page 10 was the first of the pages I sent, and it's verse 14 of this. So this is the first chapter in Vayikra, in Leviticus, when it's spoken about offerings of animals. But we were talking about heavy animals, steer or bulls, and then there was also the idea of sheep or goats. But now we're taking it down a notch as far as heaviness. And I want to talk about the heaviness. And we have the idea of an ascent offerings of fowl. And the Torah reads, if the offerer cannot afford to sacrifice an animal from the herd or flock, he may sacrifice a fowl. An offering, this costs money. A bull was going to be more expensive than a sheep, usually. And a sheep was going to be more expensive than a bird. A bird was relatively inexpensive. So there was a scale, I guess that's what we can call a sliding scale, of what offerings to be brought based on a person's financial capacity, ability. So if the offerer's sacrifice to God is an assent offering from a fowl, in other words, because that this is what they could afford, must bring one of the mature turtle doves or one of the young pigeons of either gender. The fowl does not have to be unblemished. We're much more careful about in the heavy animals. We said it can't be blemished, but with a fowl, it's okay if it's unblemished. We're less exacting for this person who really doesn't have the money to bring out the more expensive offering, but it may not be missing a limb, which is a very obvious deficiency, and it's not respectful to the exercise. And that's something we find in Jewish life, where even though we should focus on the spiritual and not the physical does matter. And therefore, if we're going to do something, a spiritual exercise, it should be done in a way that it's physically pleasing to, because we're physical human beings. And we relate to that. That's the channel through which we relate to the world. So we want to be able to see the physicality as just a channel and focus on the meaningful and the spiritual, but it's still important to maintain a dignified physical framing. So it says the offerer does not lean on assent offerings of fowl as he must for those of cattle, sheep, or goats. Turtle doves become suitable as sacrifices only once they reach the age at which their feathers have finished turning yellow. Rashi notes this because it seems there seems to be a need for some maturity of the dove. How do you tell maturity of a pigeon or a dove? It's the feathers. Pigeons are suitable as sacrifices from the age at which plucking a feather causes them to bleed until the age at which their feathers begin to turn yellow. Thus, both turtle doves and pigeons are unsuitable sacrifices during the beginning stage of their feathers' color change. Okay. So now let's we'll go to page 11.
Did you say what's the spiritual significance of why we care so much about the
Feathers?
stage of the feathers color changing? Yeah.
So I actually don't recall. I'm sure there's something about the something to the feathers. There's something we'll get into about the wings. About the color of the feathers is something. Nothing's coming up now. But what I would say is about the maturity part. Is that the maturity part is to be able to bring a substantive offering, and this that it's already reached a level of development that it's a real dove, it's a full-fledged dove or a full-fledged pigeon. That's why we want it mature, and the way to tell maturity is through the feathers. Now, if there's a specific, there's specific lessons from all the nuances. I could, if I remember, I can try and leaf around a little bit and see if there's something specific for that.
Okay, thank you. Maturity is helpful.
Sure. So now there's again, even for those of us, thinking through 21st century lens, this is an interesting way of little verse here on page 15. It's about the way to offer the fowl, because slaughtering an animal is not something it can be a very holy thing, obviously, and it is a holy thing done right, but it's not for so much for my sensitivities of doing it. I don't like even to see it done. But when it comes to it was done in the temple, when it came to it with a fowl, if we read in 15, there was a special service way of slaughtering. We call shchita, is the Hebrew word that's usually used for using a knife and slitting the throat. And in a heavy animal, I had to do the trachea and esophagus both in one sweep. And in lighter animals, less. Only one of them had to be done. But then of those two, but here there's a special service. The priest must bring the fowl to the altar, partially nip off its head by cutting through the nape of the neck, connect on the esophagus and the trachea, all with his fingernail, which he must let grow long for this purpose. There was a service that's called in Hebrew malika. A malika was cutting from the back of the neck with a long nail. This was not a simple service to do. How the Kohen had to hold in one hand both the legs and the wings of the bird. It was a tricky process to do, and seen as such in the Talmud, and then be able to cut with the nail. He must then cut off the rest of the fowl's head completely even with a knife and burn up the head on the altar. First, the fowl's blood must be made to exude from its neck onto the wall of the altar. The blood is always an important part. The blood represents our enthusiasm. In the human, it's the lifeblood, and the blood. Bring the blood to the altar. Bring our own blood, our own passions. So the altar is always an important part of any offering. Usually, is poured into a vessel and then sprinkled. And here it was directly put onto the altar, directly by squeezing the fowl's neck, but indirectly by pressing its neck against the altar wall. So what I'd like to do is I want to read a little bit further, and then we're going to come back. There's a long Hasidic insight. Let's go to page 12. He must then cut into the fowl's body, remove its crop, along with its entrails, along with the flesh and feathers opposite the crop, and then discard these pieces on the east side of the ram next to the altar, the place where the ashes removed from the altar each morning are deposited. So with the entrails and the internal organs, those were, with heavy animals, they were washed and cleansed and offered on the altar. Here, they were put to the side. The digestive organs of cattle, sheep, and goats are offered up on the altar, whereas the digestive organs of fowl are discarded. Why is the difference? It says because domesticated animals only eat their masters or ownerless food. The one thing about fowl birds is that they fly, and they fly into other people's property. That's just the nature of the animal, the nature of nature. So when we have there's a goat or a sheep or a bull being brought in, conceivably, it's either it's being fed by an owner, or maybe it's being put out to pasture somewhere where the owner has a right to pasture them, even if it's no man's land. But a bird, we have domesticated birds that we feed, but birds out there, but in general, they're out there and they're eating whatever they can get. And that means if it's something from on your deck that you left out, they're going to come and get it. A bull, a sheep, a goat is probably not coming to your deck. Therefore, the Torah shows us a sensitivity to, not that a fowl is morally wrong for what it's doing. That's the nature God gave it. So there's no moral judgment on animals. But there is a reality that in that stomach, in those entrails of the fowl, we have to assume that what is fed it is often other people's food, other people's possession. Because domesticated animals only eat their masters or owners' food, whereas fowl fly into other people's property and quote unquote rob them in order to eat. Again, there's no moral judgment on the fowl, but there is a sensitivity the Torah puts out there. It says that the entrails, the digestive system of bulls, sheep, and goats, for offering an animal, it's cleansed and brought up also as part of this offering to God, and we to be able to see this is something fit for God's altar. A digestive system that has been fed, we assume, during its lifetime by food that doesn't belong to the animal, we're going to put it to the side. It's not going to be offered on the altar. He must then, with his hands, and it's not easy to read, rip open the body of the fowl from behind with its feathers intact, but he must not tear it completely apart. The priest must then burn up the fowl's body with its feathers on the altar on top of the wood on the fire. He must burn it specifically with the intention that it be an ascent offering. Similarly, the slaughtering must be done with the intention that the fowl be a fire offering, destined to be consumed by fire that be pleasing to God. Once the sacrificial rites are completed and the animal has caught fire, the divine fire will consume the sacrifice. I believe we already mentioned that there was a miraculous fire, divine fire that came down and in the form of, and sat consistently on the altar in a flaming fire in the form of a lion. And then, but the Kohen had to bring their own humanly generated match. Even though the smell of burning feathers is revolting. God insists that the feathers be burned because since it is usually poor people who offer a fowl as a scent offerings instead of cattle, sheep, or goats, which are much larger and far more expensive, God wants their sacrifice to look substantial so they should not feel embarrassed. So even though we are concerned with how things appear and how they smell, and we're worried about the plain old human ambiance, as mentioned before, when it comes about blemishes. So for God to tell us that the feathers need to be burned means that it's going to be a bit of an unpleasant ambiance because it's a foul smell. It was worth it for there to be, the trade-off was between that or having the poor person feel a little bit better about themselves because it looked more substantial. And therefore, that was done. Similarly, although a turtle dove or pigeon is much smaller than a bull, sheep, or goat, God still considers it pleasing as the poor person has offered it up with the proper intentions. It's really, and this is something a Talmudic idea. It's not so much about what you're doing; it's how you're doing it. And people give according to their means. And for a person of limited means, to give something where they're pushing themselves is very, very precious. And we may say, well, it's only $15, doesn't help anything. It doesn't make it. That's on that end, the bookkeeping. On God's bookkeeping, if someone found it meaningful in their lives and a sacrifice on their part to give $15 to some charity, that's very, very precious to God. And obviously, for a person of great means, maybe $15 is not so precious to God. It's still money, but the question is, what are we? It's very individualized, and only God knows what it means to us and what we're giving. The remainder of the laws concerning scent offerings will be given later. Okay. So now, long note here, and we'll start with this. So just before we start on page 11, there's a general attitude that I think, just as a backdrop to this, it's at least part of it. When we are eating food, animals for food, what we're saying is that what we're going to do is we're going to use this animal. We're not allowed to hunt for sport. And as a matter of fact, it's really, we shouldn't be eating meat unless we're the Talmud tells us, unless we're in a spiritually appropriate place. Because what does the poor animal need to suffer if I'm just eating it for my own gluttony? So there's specifically that idea of really being careful about the elevation of the world, and the animal represents somewhat the physicality that we're elevating. We're wrestling with our food to be able to temper our appetites and focus on why we're eating, and to be strong and empowered to be able to be who God wants us to be. And I guess the way we call it, the heavier, the coarser, the more earthly the food, the greater the challenge. So with heavy, what we can call red meat, with heavy animals, that's considered the most difficult for us to be able to wrestle with. And they're considered, again, this isn't a moral judgment on the animals, but what they represent is and even as you eat them, there are lighter things to eat and heavier things to eat. So eating red meat is heavier, so to speak, than chicken, and fish is even lighter than that, and vegetables are even lighter than that. I mean, I think that's a pretty simple idea. Everybody can nutritionally appreciate. So here, with a heavy animal, in order for us to bring it up, to elevate it, and not be caught in its earthliness and its any coarseness of it, we have to slaughter the animal. And there's, as I mentioned before, as the trachea and the esophagus, they both are inspected. It has to be the clean cut, and it's the highest level of necessity, the highest bar of what we need to accomplish to be able to make it suitable for our plate is with a heavy animal. With a fowl, less so, because there's only one has to be inspected, and even there we say it's lighter, it's not as coarse, it's not as coarsening, and therefore it's the bar or the equation we have, the path we have to follow to make a chicken ready for our plate is not as exacting, not as demanding as the path we have to follow to make a steak ready for our plate, because it doesn't have that as much of that potentially coarsening effect. Fish doesn't need any slaughter. It has to be a proper species of fish, have to distinguish it, but make sure that it has the fins and scales. But in the words of the Talmud, its gathering is its shchita, in the sense that it has less of a potential coarsening effect, and therefore it's an easier way into our spiritual approach to life and being part of our spiritual equation. And certainly, well, agriculture, there's just have to pick it, and you don't have to check a peach or an apple to make sure that for fins and scales or anything like that. It's if it's natural, it's kosher, just to make sure it's not stolen. And I mean, there are potentially problems with it, but it's in its natural state. There's really no issue with anything agricultural. So sticking to what we're going to call animal life, which is fish, fowl, and heavy animals, we have this in ascending order of difficulty, so to speak. Fish is the easiest. You could just gather it up and eat it, and it's much more instinctively suitable for our souls. Fowl takes some preparation and to elevate it, and heavy animals even more so. And one can see this also in the nature of their creation. In the Torah, as the Torah describes the creation of animal life, it says that the animals, they came forth from the earth. They're created of earth, of dirt. In the language about creation of fowl, there's in one chapter, the first two chapters of Genesis both have elements of describing creation, and they're not always identical. So in one of those chapters, the fowl are described as coming from the water, and another of the chapters is described as coming from the earth. And the Talmud says that means the Torah is telling us that it was made from mud, water and earth together. And fish, it says, God said, let the waters teem come forth with fish life. Their creative source was water. So in Torah thinking, water is obviously it's a physical thing like anything else in the world, but it is a spiritual conduit for divinity. It was a pre-creation state, as I'm sure we've mentioned, when God created the world. When the curtain opens on creation, it doesn't say God just the Big Bang. It says in the beginning of God's creation, when there was just an unformed mass, and and water covered everything. There was darkness over the face of the deep. The world was covered by water. That transition from pure godliness to a physical world was that there was physicality covered by water, like a baby in an amniotic sac. And then the world came into formation in the 6 days or 7 days of creation. So water, it has that cleansing element. When you take a shower, water has that the mikveh input of the idea of spiritual rebirth. We know how it is to be near water. Meryl and Helen can tell us what it's to be in Florida and look out at the water. That there's a spiritual element to that just is natural, and therefore the fish being created, the stuff of their creation being water, it inclines us to think of them as more spiritually inclined physical beings, and therefore, what makes sense what we said before, they're a smoother transition into our use for us to eat, and more easily compatible with our souls. The fowl, which is water, but also with earth, which is definitely much more tangible and physical, but it's the water and the earth together, the mud. So there's something more earthy about it, but there's the water ingredient too, and therefore it's something that takes more. It's less smooth a transition into for our usage, for our soul usage, but we can take care of it. And there's the slaughtering process that makes it kosher, that elevates it, makes it part of our lives, that we can eat it and use it and lead our meaningful lives. The heavy animals, which are created just from the earth, if we're following this theme, they're going to take the most work to elevate, both in the shechita process, but also in ourselves, and looking at ourselves emotionally, how we're approaching our meals, because a meat meal has a certain level of attraction and engagement just on the animal instinctive level, and that's something we have to wrestle with. And that needs a higher bar, so to speak, of the shechita, when we have to check both the trachea and the esophagus. It's a more demanding process. Having said all of that, now let's get into the Hasidic insights. We said the priest, the Kohen, has to nip off again from the back with the back of the neck with a long nail. Fingernail. The priest must nip off of its head. We thus see that permitted animals may be divided into three categories vis-a-vis their treatment as offerings and also as food. Mammals, I said heavy animals, but they're called mammals, require ritual slaughter, both in order to be offered up as sacrifices and in order to be eaten as food. For any use of a cow or a bull, for it to be used in our spiritual service, whether it's at our kitchen table or as an offering, it has to go through the shechita, the slaughter process. Fowl are killed by nipping when they're offered up as sacrifices, and by ritual slaughter when they're eaten as food. A bird also needs processing in order to make it, for it to be part of our spiritual equation in life. But from our kitchen table, for our dining room table, it has to go through the shechita process, not as exacting as mammals, but it has to go through a shechita process. And in the temple, there's this nipping from the back. Fish are not brought as sacrifices altogether. First of all, fish are no part of the service in the temple. And when they're eaten as food, they require only to be gathered from the water, not ritual slaughter. As I mentioned before, the language of the Talmud is that gathering them in, catching the fish, they would gather with nets. That's the slaughter. What does that mean? In other words, it's ready to roll. As long as it's a kosher species of fish, it's ready to roll. The purpose of ritual slaughter, when required, is to render the animal fit to ascend from the animal kingdom into either the human kingdom by being eaten, or the divine realm by being offered as a sacrifice. It's about making this animal, which is morally neutral, into a meaningful part of our spiritual service, either by our eating it and using the energy properly, or as an offering. Ritual slaughter serves to disconnect the animal from its animality. I don't know if animality is a real word, but it works here. The idea is that if an animal has its very earthy nature, and we're trying to get above that. So how does ritual slaughter help it? It's enabling its physical constituents and life force to become part of a higher order of being. So by slaughtering it and making it part of our lunch, and then we go and help out in a soup kitchen or whatever, how we're using our energy, we are bringing this animal into the world of moral consciousness and good moral choice, which they cannot do. Without ritual slaughter, the animal retains its animalistic orientation. If it is consumed by a human being, it augments his animal nature, being elevated into his humanity. So, if I eat an animal and I'm not conscious and I'm not elevating it and I'm not trying to elevate it, so what does it do? It just empowers me to be more of an animal myself, just to be, and I'm not saying that, I don't mean that harshly, but we're all instinctively self-oriented. And when I eat food in a self-oriented way, I'm exercising my self-orientation muscle. And when I'm satisfied gastronomically, then that can make me even less less sensitive to other people who the poor person that comes to my door and is hungry because I'm full. Why what's his problem? It's the when we're satiated, when things are good, it could have a certain numbing effect to our sensitivities. So with this in mind, we can understand the different requirements of the above mentioned three categories of animals with respect to ritual slaughter. With this perspective on slaughter, the dry land, whose inhabitants are not at all connected to it. In other words, we just live on it. We're not like animals totally encompassed by water, not like fish, totally encompassed by water. We live on the land. We're not encompassed by the land. That can be seen as an allegory for a physical world in which divinity is so obscure that we appear to exist independently of any divine life force. The difference between this and fish, and I should mention before also, fish live in their life force. So if we could get into the psyche of a fish, at least the imagery of it is that the fish, no fish says to another, you think there's water? You think, and that's what's keeping us alive? Or are we just independent? They're looking at the water. They're in the water. They know that if they're out of the water, they're dead. So their life force is very much part of their consciousness. For us, you learn about oxygen, you don't think about it as much. First, you have to learn about it to recognize how dependent we are on it, but just instinctively, we're not dependent on anyone. We're independent. We do our own thing. That's it's a certain arrogance, which isn't true, but it's the feeling of that I exist, and maybe oxygen does too, or maybe God does too. Maybe I there's another life force, or maybe not. I don't have to pay attention to it because I've got other things bothering me. And a fish always has the humility of knowing that it has its life force, and it sees the life force right in front of its eyes. So therefore, when we say this, that we appear to exist independently of any divine life force. The ocean, in contrast, is an allegory for the spiritual worlds, in which divinity is revealed and whose denizens are therefore aware of the fact that they owe their existence to the divine life force within them, much as fish must remain in the water in order to live. Now, mammals, who are created from earth, are thus archetypes of non-divine earthly consciousness. So the animal represents this kind of a spiritually insensitive, spiritually numb existence. Again, animals are morally neutral. This is not a thing that there's something spiritually wrong with animals, but the existence is one that it just exists, and it eats and whatever and it lives and it sleeps, but it doesn't show any connection to a life force, and it doesn't. It's very much earthy. They can be lifted above the earth, but they cannot fly above it on their own. Another thing is also mammals are connected to the earth. That's where they nest. That's where they live. But they cannot. But similarly, our animal dimension, our physical body, and its animal soul is naturally drawn downward toward materiality, and therefore requires the complete rehabilitation effected by ritual slaughter in order to be elevated above its natural condition. Another point which I mentioned before, a difference between fowl and mammals, is that fowl have this, they soar, they fly. They're not as connected, and I said before that they're created both from earth and water, but so there's the earthiness, but they can physically, spatially, they can fly above the earth. They can soar, and therefore there's a certain transcendence element to fowl that we don't find in mammals. And that's why for mammals, in order to be able to completely bring it to our level of appropriateness for our lives, it goes through has to go through a much more demanding set of steps of shechita. Fowl, we are told, were created from mud, earth mixed with water, indicating that their earthly nature is more dilute than that of earthbound animals. Thus, they can fly, but they still have to rest upon the earth when tired. Similarly, our avian dimension, our natural intellect, can soar beyond mundane reality and catch a glimpse of sublime levels of divinity. So this is something we find in Hasidic thought. There's so much imagery here, that a difference between, we all have psyche, human psyche. And the human psyche, as I said before, is naturally self-oriented. So my instinctive appetite, my sensual part, is all about what feels good for me. That's all it is. It's about what tastes good, what feels good, the instinct part. My reasoning, my mind, doesn't necessarily have to be spiritual, but my mind can help me to look at something and say, yes, that looks good for me, but it's not good for me. My cholesterol, whatever it is, it's not for me. It can transcend just the trap of our purely sensual desires. So in Hasidic thought, we say that there's my impulses, and then there's my reasoning, my rationale. Rationale allows me, at least periodically, to rise above the trap of just purely doing what feels good to me, and allows me to transcend it. So that can take me in a spiritual, godly, Torah direction, or it could not. It could just be saying, I want to look good on the beach, and therefore eating this is not good for me. So I'm going to delay or avoid my self-gratification right now. I want that steak because I have another selfish need. I want to look good on the beach. But that itself is something that an animal can do. And it shows a certain amount of discipline and self-control, even if it's all self-oriented, but it's a little bit more refined. So the mind can take us to truly meaningful places, or can at least take us to some self-control places, which is better than just being purely just all sensuality driven. So that's what we're talking about here. It can soar beyond the mundane reality and catch a glimpse of sublime levels of divinity through our study, through our thinking, contemplation, meditation. Nonetheless, its conceptual abilities remain limited by its human nature. Therefore, the intellect generally also needs to be slaughtered in order to be uplifted beyond its natural condition. So therefore, even the fowl, recognize it represents not a purely sensual driven existence, but one that can soar, that also needs shechita. Because the mind itself and reason itself is it's not purely holy. It's not necessarily going to take you in a holy direction. People can use their minds to hurt people. They can come up with ingenious ways to steal and damage. It's a tool. It's a helpful tool, humanly, but in order to make sure it's a holy tool, that also needs shechita. It doesn't need the same shechita as pure sensuality focus, but it needs shechita. It needs elevation. Fish are created from the water and must remain there in order to stay alive. Similarly, our Piscean dimension, our divine soul, retains at all times its pure and unsullied connection with the source. So if in the human psyche, there's our basic sensual drives are the heavy animals, our intellect, just our human intellect, that's the fowl, but fish is our holiness, that's our godly soul. And that's always surrounded by water. It never loses connection with its life force, the source of all life. It does not need to be slaughtered, for it has not lost its divine connection. However, because it has descended into the body and become vested in the animal's soul, fact is, we don't just operate as divine souls. We operate as human beings, and the divine soul is working through those channels. It can become diverted from its godly mission, so must be gathered. So the language of the Talmud is therefore very precise. You have to just gathering it in as a shechita. So the idea of what Hasidic thought says is gathering in our thoughts, gathering in our minds, our focus, keeping focus. Keeping focus is a very big struggle, and something that we comes up in our prayers and spiritual exercises. So gathering in ourselves, refocusing on this goal. Alternatively, a little bit of a different lane here. These three categories of creatures can be taken to allude to the three ways people may be categorized with respect to their progress in spiritual growth. The three different creatures are three different levels of spiritual growth. Mammals correspond to the wicked, who have succumbed to the pull of their material drives. Fish correspond to the righteous, who have so refined themselves that they are no longer challenged by evil. Fowl are the intermediates, who constantly struggle with their earthly desires but successfully refrain from wrongdoing. So this is from a particularly Chabad lens on the Torah, one of the foundational perspectives that the founder of Chabad brought to the world in his book called Tanya. It's Chabad, the foundation of Chabad philosophy is that he, in looking at the Talmud and Torah writings, he called attention to the idea that there are three different categories of spiritual categories within humanity, within our people, and one we call the righteous, and one we call someone wicked. I mean, and they're depending on their actions, obviously, and then there's something we call an intermediate. So he makes a very strong case, just in understanding the Talmud itself, that it's very hard to say it's just because about what you're doing, because if someone it sits on their computer and has a Zoom with someone and keeping them company or helping their lives, reaching out to them because they're still closeted because of COVID, that's a beautiful thing. They're doing a mitzvah, so they're a tzaddik. If they walk outside the room and they say speak lashon hara, they did something wrong. That's a Russia, wicked. He'd be bouncing around from moment to moment. So while it is true that we do bounce around and things we do, he says that the tzaddik, the Rasha, and what we call the Mendy, which is the intermediate, is really commentaries on where we are soul-wise. And just in brief, just because they're bringing it up, the Rasha is someone whose selfish needs are really driving the bus. Doesn't mean that they're doing everything evil, but it's about themselves. The Mendy, the intermediate person, is a person who, in behavior, is actually does everything right, but they still struggle with their impulses. So they're not speaking any lashon hara, they're not any negative gossip, but they got a good piece and they really want to share it with you, and then they override it, they squelch it. That's the intermediate person, not because they're an average person on some divine scoreboard of what they do. They're doing everything right, but it means that in their internal dynamics, it's still a struggle. And for the righteous, which is a very rare thing, the tzaddik, and we say that that's a person who has really conquered even impulses, which is it's just not it's not even a goal for us because we can't. Like there's none of us. I feel comfortable saying none of us have the ability to control which thoughts fall into our minds, because that's subconscious. We can't cleanse the subconscious. Now the struggle is when a thought falls into our minds, whether to use an easy one to share a piece of gossip about someone else. So we have the urge. And we tell ourselves, no, we're not going to do it. And we instead we share a meaningful thought with a friend. That's beautiful, and that's the most we can do, and the most God can ask of us. There are people who actually cleanse even the subconscious, that they don't even have the instinct anymore. That we're going to call the tzaddik. So, in these contexts. So mammals correspond to the wicked, who have succumbed to the pull of the material drives. Fish correspond to the righteous, who have so refined themselves that they're no longer challenged by evil. Fowl are the intermediaries, who constantly struggle with their earthly desires, but successfully refrain from wrongdoing. In these contexts, we can understand why fish are not brought as sacrifices. So now we can start to understand why are fish never brought as sacrifices. The purpose of the sacrifices is to refine and elevate the human/animal soul. The divine soul, therefore, or someone who is completely identified with it, has no place on the altar. The whole point of the altar was that it was a place, a venue for us to bring our own selfishness, our own humanness, which is great, but it has a struggle to it. And we bring it to the altar to give it to God and say we're trying to get past this. We're giving of our own selfish needs in the form of this animal, and we are consuming it with a divine fire. It's the place of the altar is a place of a human struggle. Well, for the fish, there's no human struggle, immorally. So there's no need to bring fish on the altar. There was no point in it. Fowl and mammals, in contrast, are brought as sacrifices, and both are sacrificed by cutting off the flow of blood and food between the head and the body. Okay, so the imagery here is that we're severing a body from its head. Now, that's kind of gory, but you just think about it conceptually. What does it mean, separating a body from its head? This indicates that the elevation of the animal out of its animality is accomplished by severing the intellect from the emotions of the body, so that our animalistic urges not befoul our intellect. One of the big problems that we all face is the struggle between our emotions, and meaning our urges, and what we know is correct. So we look consistently, we look at the news and you see bright people, and if we're reading them, they're in leadership positions, who have wonderful careers and do a lot of good things, and they allow their very human urges to jeopardize or sometimes destroy everything. It makes no sense, and they know it makes no sense, because they must know it makes no sense, because they're bright people. So what happens? How does a bright person do something so stupid? I mean, I would imagine that all of us would have the same question. How does someone who has a great career, have a wonderful family, and just for some momentary pleasure, they jeopardize it or they destroyed it? Was that worth it? And in the analysis of things, the rational analysis, of course it's not worth it. Why would you even try that? Why would you risk it? But urges have this way of blinding us. Emotions have a way of blinding us. So the idea of severing the head from the body means severing the intellect from the emotions, so that the animalistic urges not befoul our intellect, so we can think clearly. Which is one of the reasons in Torah law, a person can't sit as a judge or be a witness on if it's about a family member, because your feelings for the person are going to change your perspective. That's not. We need clean intellect and clean analysis, which must be left free to focus on divinity. With this in mind, we can understand the difference between how fowl and mammals are sacrificed. So it's getting like, we'll leave it over here, but then we'll re-engage next week.
Thank you.
We're not gonna be able to finish it now. Sorry?
Oh, I just said thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Well.
Okay, thank you.
See you next week.
Mendy,
Yes, ma'am.
this was very hard for me, so I put you on very, very low because I will not sleep tonight. When you talked about the birds, that was
Yeah, so,
that was tough.
Helen, I was thinking about you, and
I just didn't want to miss your class.
well,
It's
okay.
hard for me.
I'm gonna thank you for being here anyway. I know this isn't easy.
Thank you,
Okay.
thank you. God
Okay.
willing, this part of the will be
The Chumash, you entered just at the right time, huh? So, but
are you going to be talking about it next week too?
well, we're gonna finish this. The offerings are really gonna be for at least a few weeks. Yeah.
All right, well, I'll see, but I had to turn it off.
I'm not surprised.
I know you do it with such sensitivity and I appreciate that, but it's hard on me.
Well,
Thank you.
thanks for joining us.
All right, be well.
Though.